I never thought I'd be thankful for my terrible habit of leaving my computer's webcam running, but life has a funny way of working out sometimes. What started as a normal Tuesday morning quickly turned into what I now refer to as the Great HOA Showdown of Cedar Grove. I should probably mention that I'm Sarah Chen, and until recently, I was just another quiet homeowner in our peaceful suburban community. Well, as peaceful as any neighborhood can be, with Linda Morrison, our self-promoted HOA queen, at the helm. Let me set the scene. I work from home as a software developer, and my home office faces our meticulously maintained front yard. The previous owners had installed these gorgeous floor-to-ceiling windows which usually provide the perfect amount of natural light for my coding sessions. Today, those windows would become the center of an absolutely bizarre confrontation that would change our neighborhood forever. It was just past 9 a.m. when I heard the distinct sound of heels clicking aggressively up my driveway. I didn't need to look up to know it was Linda. She had a very particular way of walking, like each step was a personal assault on the concrete beneath her feet. I continued typing, pretending I hadn't noticed her approach. My webcam was running because I'd forgotten to turn it off after my morning team meeting, something that would later prove to be surprisingly fortunate. The doorbell rang once, then immediately again and again. Linda's signature move. I took a deep breath, saved my work, and made my way to the door. As I opened it, I was greeted by the sight of Linda Morrison in all her glory. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and a hot pink blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Sarah," she said, managing to make my name sound like an accusation, "we need to discuss your garden gnome situation." She didn't wait for an invitation before stepping past me into my foyer, her designer heels clicking against my hardwood floors. I blinked, momentarily confused. My garden gnome situation? "Yes," Linda huffed, pulling out her phone and furiously scrolling through what I assumed was her personal catalog of neighborhood infractions. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that all lawn decorations must be approved by the board. Your, she paused dramatically, unconventional addition was not approved. The unconventional addition she was referring to was a single garden gnome barely 8 inches tall, wearing a tiny rainbow pride flag as a cape. It had been a gift from my niece, and it made me smile every time I walked past it. I'd placed it partially hidden behind a rose bush, barely visible unless you were specifically looking for it. "Linda," I said, keeping my voice level, "I've reviewed the bylaws thoroughly. They specify that lawn decorations visible from the street require approval. My gnome is behind my roses, and you can't see it unless you're standing in my garden. Which, by the way, raises the question of why you were in my garden in the first place." I saw her jaw tighten, and a familiar flush crept up her neck, the same one I'd seen when she'd tried to fine the Johnsons for having a bird feeder last month. "The bylaws are subject to interpretation by the board, and as president—" "You're not the president, Linda," I interrupted gently. "You're the vice president. Mr. Patterson is the president, and he's already seen the gnome. He thought it was charming." That was the moment something shifted in Linda's eyes. Looking back, I should have recognized it as the warning sign it was. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles went white. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we'll just see what the board has to say about this at the emergency meeting I'll be calling for this afternoon. And while we're discussing violations, let's talk about your unapproved security cameras." I frowned. "I don't have any security cameras, Linda." She smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "Exactly. Section 12, Paragraph 8. All homes must maintain standard security measures as outlined in the Community Safety Guidelines. Your lack of visible security cameras is a violation." "That's not what that means, and you know it," I replied, struggling to maintain my composure. "The guidelines suggest security measures as an option, not a requirement. I have good locks and motion sensor lights, which more than satisfy the basic safety recommendations." Linda's smile didn't waver, but her eye twitched slightly. "We'll add it to the agenda for today's meeting, 2 o'clock sharp. Don't be late." She turned on her heel and strode toward the door, pausing dramatically in the doorway. "Oh, and Sarah, you might want to check your tires before you try to drive anywhere. These roads can be so unpredictable sometimes." Before I could process what she meant, she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her overwhelming perfume and an ominous feeling in my stomach. I immediately went to my window and watched as she strutted down my driveway, her phone already pressed to her ear. Something about her parting words set off alarm bells in my head. I grabbed my keys and headed out to check my car, and that's when I saw it. My driver's side tire was completely flat. At first I thought it might have been bad luck, but then I spotted the cause. A handful of roofing nails scattered around my tire. They definitely hadn't been there when I'd brought in groceries the night before. What Linda didn't know, what none of my neighbors knew, was that this wasn't actually my car. My regular vehicle was in the shop, and I was borrowing one from a family friend while they were out of town. A family friend who happened to be Chief Amanda Roberts of the Cedar Grove Police Department. I took out my phone and carefully documented everything, making sure to get clear photos of the nails and their suspicious placement around only my tire. Then I went back inside, pulled up my webcam footage and started reviewing it. Sure enough, there was Linda, early this morning, deliberately sprinkling something near my car. The video quality was surprisingly good enough to see the brand name on the box of roofing nails she was carrying. I was so focused on the footage that I almost missed the sound. It started as a sharp crack, followed by the distinctive tinkling of breaking glass. I spun around just in time to see my beautiful floor-to-ceiling window explode inward, accompanied by what appeared to be a large landscaping rock. And there, standing on my front lawn in broad daylight, was Linda Morrison, another rock already in her hand. She hadn't noticed that my webcam was still running, its little red light blinking away as it captured every second of her meltdown. She also hadn't noticed that Mrs. Garcia from across the street had come out to water her plants, or that Mr. Thompson was walking his dog and had stopped dead in his tracks, phone already raised and recording. Linda drew back her arm for another throw, and I couldn't help but notice that her form was actually pretty impressive. She'd clearly played softball at some point. As the second rock sailed through what remained of my window, I heard Mrs. Garcia's shocked gasp and Mr. Thompson's "Oh my God, are you getting this?" to someone on his phone. I stood there, surrounded by broken glass, watching Linda reach for a third rock, and couldn't help but think that this was about so much more than a rainbow-caped garden gnome. This was years of unchecked entitlement finally boiling over, and thanks to my forgotten webcam and an audience of shocked neighbors, every second was being documented in glorious high definition. Linda paused, rock in hand, as several car doors slammed nearby. Apparently Mr. Thompson hadn't just been recording, he'd been on a group call with other neighbors. Within minutes, half the block had emerged to witness the spectacle, phones raised, creating a live-streaming audience for Linda's spectacular fall from grace. What happened next would become neighborhood legend, but for now let me just say that Linda's face, when she finally noticed all the phones pointed at her, was a masterpiece of dawning realization. The rock slipped from her fingers, and I swear I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out how she was going to explain this one to the HOA board. Little did she know explaining it to the board would be the least of her concerns, because at that very moment I heard the distinct sound of police sirens in the distance, growing closer by the second, and I had a feeling Chief Roberts was going to be very interested in what had happened to her car. The growing crowd of neighbors had formed a loose semicircle around my yard, creating an inadvertent amphitheater for Linda's performance. I noticed Jenny Williams, who runs our neighborhood's surprisingly active Facebook group, narrating the scene in real time as she live-streamed. For those just joining us, HOA Vice President Linda Morrison has just thrown multiple rocks through Sarah Chen's windows. Yes, those gorgeous floor-to-ceiling windows we all admired during last year's holiday home tour. And yes, this is the same Linda who tried to ban Christmas lights for being too festive last December. Linda's head whipped around at the sound of Jenny's voice, seemingly just now registering the size of her audience. Her perfectly maintained facade began to crack, literally, as her thick foundation showed distinct stress lines around her mouth and eyes. This is a private HOA matter," she stammered, her voice lacking its usual authoritative tone. "Everyone needs to leave immediately. I am conducting official business." "Official business usually doesn't involve vandalism, Linda," called out Mr. Rodriguez from next door, his phone steady as he continued recording. "Pretty sure that's not in the bylaws." I took advantage of the momentary distraction to grab my laptop, making sure the webcam was still recording. Through the broken window, I could hear Linda's increasingly desperate attempts to regain control of the situation. "You don't understand," she was saying, her voice rising in pitch. "She's destroying property values with her inappropriate decorations and her complete disregard for community standards." She gestured wildly toward my partially hidden garden gnome, which seemed to smile serenely back at her from behind its rosebush shelter. Mrs. Garcia, still holding her forgotten watering can, stepped forward. "Linda, mi amor, the only property value being destroyed right now is Sarah's, and possibly your own when she takes you to court for this." Despite her gentle tone, Mrs. Garcia's words seemed to hit Linda like a physical blow. The sound of sirens was getting closer, and Linda's composure was crumbling faster than my windows had. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out what I recognized as our HOA rule book, a thick binder she'd personally annotated with color-coded tabs and highlighting. "If you'd all just look at Section 7, Paragraph 3, she began, flipping pages frantically, "and cross-reference it with Appendix C regarding community standards." "Put the binder down and step away from the house," a commanding voice cut through the chaos, and I looked up to see 3 police cars pulling up to my curb, lights flashing. Chief Amanda Roberts herself stepped out of the lead vehicle, her expression a perfect mix of professional concern and barely concealed anger as she surveyed the scene. Linda, still clutching her rulebook like a shield, turned to face the chief. "Oh, thank goodness you're here. I was just trying to address some serious HOA violations and—" "Ma'am," Chief Roberts interrupted, her voice stern, "I can see at least 3 serious legal violations from where I'm standing, and none of them have anything to do with homeowners associations." She turned to address the crowd of neighbors. "Would anyone like to tell me what happened here?" The neighborhood responded with a chorus of raised phones, each containing video evidence of Linda's meltdown. Jenny Williams stepped forward, her live stream still running. "Chief, I have the whole thing recorded, including her threats about Sarah's tires before the window incident." Linda's face, already pale, went almost translucent. "Threats? I wouldn't—" She stopped as Chief Roberts moved to inspect her car. Her police chief's car, with its suspiciously flat tire. "Mrs. Morrison," Chief Roberts said, her voice deceptively calm, "I'd like you to explain why there are roofing nails around the tire of my vehicle." She held up one of the nails, which glinted accusingly in the late morning sun. And that's when Linda did something that would become the stuff of neighborhood legend. She threw her HOA rulebook at Chief Roberts. The binder sailed through the air in a graceless arc, papers flying loose like confetti before landing with a sad plop at the chief's feet. The crowd collectively gasped, and someone, I think it was Mr. Thompson, let out a low whistle. "Well," Chief Roberts said, looking down at the scattered pages of bylaws and regulations, "I think we can add assaulting a police officer to the list of charges." She nodded to one of her officers, who stepped forward with handcuffs at the ready. Linda's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: denial, anger, bargaining, and finally, as the handcuffs clicked into place, something that looked like acceptance tinged with horror. As she was led to the police car, she turned to me with wide, mascara-smeared eyes. "My husband is a lawyer," she declared, but her voice wavered. "He'll have this sorted out by dinner." What Linda didn't know was that her husband, a partner at one of the city's most prestigious law firms, was at that very moment watching his wife's meltdown via Jenny's live stream, along with what appeared to be half of Cedar Grove, and judging by the rapid-fire notifications popping up on Jenny's phone, the video was already spreading well beyond our neighborhood. I stood in my glass-strewn living room, watching as Linda was helped into the back of a police car, her pink blazer collecting glittering shards of my window as she ducked her head. Chief Roberts was taking statements from neighbors, each eager to share their own stories of Linda's HOA tyranny. Mrs. Garcia had brought over her broom and dustpan and was already helping to clean up the mess, muttering under her breath The day was far from over, and I had a feeling that by the time the sun set, Cedar Grove would never be quite the same. But as I watched my neighbors come together, offering help and support, I couldn't help but think that maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. And my little rainbow-caped garden gnome, he just kept smiling, barely visible behind his rose bush, like he knew something the rest of us were just figuring out. Sometimes it takes a broken window to let in some fresh air. The police were still taking statements, neighbors were still recording everything on their phones, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the distinct sound of a news helicopter approaching. Part of me wondered if I should change out of my work-from-home sweatpants before the local news showed up. But then again, that felt like something Linda would worry about. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mr. Patterson, our actual HOA president. He answered on the first ring. "Sarah," he said, sounding slightly out of breath, "I just got tagged in Jenny's live stream. Tell me that's not really Linda throwing rocks through your window." "I wish I could," I replied, watching as another police car pulled up. "But that's not even the craziest part." I spent the next hour watching my quiet suburban street transform into something resembling a media circus. By the time I finished explaining everything to Mr. Patterson, 2 local news vans had parked across the street, and Jenny's live stream had apparently gone viral enough to crash our neighborhood Facebook group's servers. "I've called an emergency HOA meeting for 4 p.m., Mr. Patterson said, sounding more energized than I'd ever heard him. "Not that there's much to discuss. Linda's actions have violated at least 15 different bylaws, not to mention actual laws." He paused, then added, "By the way, my wife loves your garden gnome." As I hung up, Officer Rodriguez, no relation to my neighbor, was finishing up taking my statement. She'd been particularly interested in my webcam footage, which showed not only Linda's rock-throwing performance, but also her early morning nail-scattering activities. "This is about as clear-cut as it gets," she said, sending the video files to the department server. "Though I have to ask, what started all this?" I led her to my front garden and pointed to my tiny rainbow-caped crusader, still maintaining his cheerful vigil behind the roses. Officer Rodriguez stared at it for a moment, then burst out laughing. "That's it? That's what caused," she gestured at the chaos around us, "all of this?" "Well," I said, "I think it was more the final straw than the actual cause." I explained about Linda's escalating behavior over the past year. The Christmas light restrictions, the attempted bird feeder ban, the time she tried to fine the Henderson kids for running a non-approved lemonade stand. "Speaking of fines," Chief Roberts interrupted, joining our conversation, "we're adding criminal mischief and vandalism to the charges. The damage to your windows alone is well into felony territory." She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message. "And my husband says to tell you not to worry about his car, he's just sad he missed all the excitement." The chief had just finished explaining the next steps in the legal process when a sleek black Mercedes came screeching around the corner. It barely stopped before a man in an expensive suit erupted from the driver's seat. Linda's husband, Richard Morrison, looking considerably less polished than usual. "Where is she?" he demanded, then spotted the police car where Linda sat, still handcuffed. He started toward it, but Chief Roberts intercepted him. "Mr. Morrison," she said firmly, "I understand you're a lawyer, so I'm sure you appreciate that approaching a detained suspect, even your wife, isn't appropriate right now." She gestured to where Officer Rodriguez stood ready, with her body camera running. "Though, if you'd like to make a statement—" Richard deflated visibly, his lawyer instincts apparently overriding his husband ones. No, not at this time." He turned to me, and I was surprised to see genuine distress on his face. "Miss Chen, I can't even begin to apologize. I've been telling Linda for months that she needed to step back from the HOA, maybe talk to someone about stress management. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting it completely. "I'll cover all the damages, of course. Any other expenses?" "You might want to hold off on writing any checks," called out Jenny, who was still documenting everything. "The internet has opinions about Linda's behavior." She turned her phone so we could see the comments flowing across her live stream. Several people have mentioned class action possibilities. Apparently, Linda's enthusiastic interpretation of HOA rules has affected more than just our neighborhood. Richard's face went through several interesting colors before settling on a sort of grayish white. "More than?" He pulled out his own phone and started scrolling rapidly. "Oh God," he muttered. "The Riverside development too, and Pine Valley. Linda's been consulting for their HOA boards." He looked up at Chief Roberts. "I need to make some calls, many calls." As Richard speed-walked away, already dialing his phone, Mrs. Garcia approached with a tray of iced tea. Somehow, in the midst of all this chaos, she'd not only helped clean up most of the broken glass but had also apparently had time to make refreshments. "Para los nervios," she said, handing me a glass. "For the nerves. Though you seem to be handling this very well, querida." I took a grateful sip. I think I'm still in shock. It doesn't quite feel real yet. "Oh, it's real," said Mr. Thompson, joining us with his phone held out. "You're trending on Twitter. Well, not you specifically, but HOA Karen and Gnomegate are both picking up steam." He showed me a clip someone had already edited together, set to dramatic music. "You might want to turn off your notifications for a while." The next few hours passed in a blur of police procedures, insurance adjusters, and increasingly elaborate theories from my neighbors about what Linda might have against garden gnomes. The news crews had somehow figured out that Linda had also been consulting for other HOA boards in the area, and their vans multiplied as reporters chased down leads about similar incidents in other neighborhoods. By the time the emergency HOA meeting rolled around at 4 p.m., the story had evolved from a simple case of property damage into what the local news was calling a systematic pattern of HOA overreach and intimidation. Reporters had dug up dozens of complaints about Linda's actions across multiple communities, and homeowners were coming forward with their own stories of excessive fines and questionable rule enforcement. The meeting itself was less emergency and more formality. Linda's position as vice president was unanimously terminated, and Mr. Patterson announced a complete review of all HOA rules and enforcement procedures. "We're going to reset everything," he declared to enthusiastic applause. "Make this a community organization that actually serves the community." As the meeting wrapped up, Jenny rushed in with an update from her still-running live stream. "You're not going to believe this," she said, practically bouncing with excitement. "Someone started a GoFundMe for Linda's victims to help appeal all those fines she imposed. It's already at $50,000. And," she paused dramatically, "there's talk of a class action lawsuit. Richard's law firm has already issued a statement distancing themselves from the whole situation." "I still can't believe all of this started over a garden gnome," Mrs. Garcia said, shaking her head. "It wasn't really about the gnome, though, was it?" I mused, thinking about Linda's increasingly erratic behavior over the past year. It was about control, about someone finally saying no to her power trips. "Speaking of the gnome," Mr. Patterson said with a slight smile, "I move that we officially approve it as the first decoration under our new, simplified community guidelines." The vote was unanimous, with several members suggesting we make the rainbow-caped gnome our new neighborhood logo. The sun was setting by the time I finally made it back home. My windows were temporarily boarded up, but the insurance adjuster had already approved emergency replacement, and Richard's credit card was on file with the glass company. Chief Roberts had arranged for extra patrols around my house, though she assured me Linda would likely be dealing with legal issues for quite a while. As I checked my mail, I found a pile of cards and notes from neighbors, offers of help, messages of support, and even a few rainbow gnome drawings from the Henderson kids. Mrs. Garcia had organized a dinner rotation until my windows were fixed, and Mr. Rodriguez offered to install a proper security system free of charge. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Linda's story had made national headlines, sparking discussions about HOA oversight and community governance across the country. There were already talks of proposed legislation to prevent similar abuses of power, with several state representatives citing Gnomegate as a wake-up call for HOA reform. Later that evening, as I sat in my kitchen enjoying Mrs. Garcia's homemade enchiladas, I glimpsed movement in my front yard. Looking out through the temporary boards, I saw several small shapes in the gathering dusk. My neighbors had apparently gone shopping. Dozens of garden gnomes now lined my front walk, each wearing a tiny rainbow cape. I couldn't help but laugh. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about bringing people together and creating positive change. Linda had wanted to control our neighborhood through fear and intimidation. Instead, she'd accidentally inspired us to build something better, a real community. As for my original gnome, the one that started it all, he still stands in his spot behind the roses, smiling his serene little smile. But now he's not just a garden decoration. He's a symbol of standing up to bullies and the power of community spirit. And if his rainbow cape seems to flutter a bit more proudly these days, well, I'd say he's earned it. P.S. Linda's court date is next month. Ginny's already planning the live stream.